I think to get us started off, I mean, there's a lot of places we could start. I think the most interesting place for folks to know is kind of, you have like one of the best titles of folks who I know. So can you tell us, I know right now you're listed as the head of learning engineering at Talespin. Can you tell us
Yes,
a little bit about what learning engineering is?
absolutely. So, yes, I am head of learning engineering at Talespin. And what learning engineering is both a process and a practice that applies the learning sciences, human-centered, and design engineering methodologies to support learners and their learning environments, really. And so, learning engineering as a practice, what my job is to really understand what the conditions are for supporting learners throughout our learning experiences and our learning ecosystem, and using data-driven decision-making to do so and setting up that infrastructure.
So already I know, like in our field, instructional design, like there's instructional designers and learning designers. So if we think about like instructional design as like being based in instructional theory, where does
Mhm.
that intersect with learning engineering? Is it more application of data in a special way, or I guess how does it differ from what we previously know about learning roles at different companies?
That's a great question. And I would say that learning engineering, as compared to instructional design, does apply those same disciplines, right? So, learning engineering is a combination of learning experience design, instructional design, user-centered design, user research, data science, learning analytics. So it's really a combination of many different disciplines. And I would say, in terms of how we might compare that to what we traditionally know or think about instructional design, we could think about it as applying data-driven decision making to instructional design, and really thinking about it from a data-centric point of view for that iterative design and development of our learning solutions.
Got
And
it.
we
And
can't we can't forget the application of learning sciences. And I do know that at the core, that is something that we do with instructional design. Hopefully do, right. That's something that we're taught in when we're going to school for, or like any sort of, I guess, higher ed programming for it. But I do acknowledge that that's not always front and center when we are applying it in practice. And for learning engineering, that is definitely something at the forefront.
it's funny you mentioned that. I mean, by this time, in if you're listening to the full episode, you will know that I one of the wonderful opportunities I had was to go to school with Kristin, and we studied instructional design theory together. I guess thinking back on those days, it is interesting to me that a lot of the when we talk about data-driven decision making or data-driven design, I think one of the big things that was harped on is instructional design theory, but I know that
Mhm.
that data piece was missing, and I think that's something that's missing from a lot of um, a lot of learning curriculums about how to be a learning designer or instructional designer, whatever you're calling that. And I know from my experience, I only really got that like on the job, and it was really dependent on if my company was um had good data, was tracking good data, had the systems for data. So I'm wondering, was learning engineering, was that something that you picked up on the way, or maybe you took a class I didn't? Yeah. How did you start when did you start applying kind of that engineering approach? Because we do talk about the iterative
Yeah.
process in school, but
Mhm.
what that actually looks like, it has to be driven by data. In most cases, that was qualitative data, but I'm sure
Mhm.
you're focusing on it much more precisely.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I discovered there's actually an IEEE, they call it Icicle. It's an industry consortium for learning engineering. There's a group that is helping to define what this discipline is. And I found them, I want to say in early 2021, that I joined. They have a monthly meetup where, folks convene and learn more about the discipline. And they also have these special interest groups that I have joined to really help conceptualize what learning engineering is in terms of instrumentation or as applied to design. And
Mm-hmm.
so I want to say that it was really when I first joined this group that I was able to put a label on it. But
Mm.
when I want to say my first job out of the teachers college, I was hired by an ed tech company that was very research focused. We had received a number of different grants from the Department of Ed to either create learning products or educational games or evaluate the efficacy of them. And so for me, design, like research was very much at the core of the way I approached many of the design projects that I was a part of, simply because we really had to go from paper prototyping to, an alpha, a beta, and then release, because that was
Mm-hmm.
part of our contract with the Institute for Education Sciences, and being able to explain, being able to report that to them in our progress for creating these educational products. And so for me, I would say that data-driven decision-making and being able to iterate from one iteration to the next based off of this evidence that we've been collecting, either from users or from systems, that was very important to me. And I want to say from the very beginning.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's incredibly fortunate, because I think a lot of learning folks, they get into, if they get into traditional L&D and they're working at a large corporation, it's like they're asked to tell stories with data. And
Mhm.
if you don't have, that analytical background or that analytical mindset, that's definitely a skill that you need to build. So I'm glad you had that opportunity there. And then I think that, just thinking along, your career, you kind of ended up at Talespin, where you're doing more, you're doing VR based learning, which I think is, I think that is something that it's interesting, because VR is an emerging technology. I think when it came out, I'm going to say it really made a big splash at 2017. That's kind of my experience with it. It's like it had this huge hype, and I think the learning community got very excited about it. I'm curious, from your perspective and your slice of the learning world, kind of what is the state of VR learning? Because it's been kind of folded in with all these other technologies that have come up since, but kind of where are we at the moment?
I think we're at a very interesting place right now in terms of VR learning. I think,
Mm-hmm.
the industry is really recognizing it as a viable medium, especially with more commercial headsets that
Mm-hmm.
are fairly affordable on the market. I hope and I think that will only get better as time goes on. Apple is releasing a headset in Q1 of next year. It is fairly pricey, but if we think about the advancement of technology, I think it's only a matter of time before we're able to get more affordable headsets on the market with crazy features that we can then leverage for learning. And I think with more affordable tech, there will be the adoption will follow, right?
Yeah.
We've been able to sort of get around that nowadays with allowing things like web VR or access to immersive virtual reality experiences on desktop browser. But it doesn't quite have that fully immersive experience that one would have if they have a heads-up display on their head.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, because I think thinking about, I'm excited about the Apple Vision. I think it's a bit more wearable than
Mhm.
headsets that we've had before. And a couple of things that you mentioned there is like that experience of, I think everybody has the idea of what virtual reality is, but then the actual experiences, you have a computer on it's strapped to your face. Like even the Apple Vision, that is a really advanced computer and a really advanced display, and it doesn't even, I think it's revolutionary in that it's not even just showing you a pass through, or it's showing you a pass through, meaning it's, their cameras on the outside and it's showing you that image in front of your whole eyes, and
Yeah.
making that look real. But at the end of the day, it's, still it plugs into a battery pack that sits in your pocket, and it has an elastic strap that goes around your head, which I think is, anybody who's tried a VR headset realizes that that is a bit different than kind of what we imagine from the images of like Ready Player One, where it's a fully
Mhm.
immersive environment. So we've definitely come a long way. And I think the Apple Vision hopefully is going to be the most comfortable version yet.
I
Um,
hope so. Yeah, I agree. It looks so awesome. I'm really excited for it. I don't know if I'll ever have the opportunity to play it, in the near future, but I do feel like, Apple has a way of just really changing the game, right? When it comes to
yeah.
technology and usability, right? So I'm
Yes.
really excited to see how the industry and our design practices will evolve with the release of this new headset.
Yeah, and they're definitely the company that we want building the hardware. But that leads me to think of what's inside. And when I think of why, in 2017, I think everybody got really excited about VR content,
Mhm.
and this idea of full immersion or immersive storytelling was very big. And I remember
Yeah.
there's a lot of 360 kind of passive experiences that you could enjoy. But I think what was missing, and why, one of the reasons that it didn't take off, is there just wasn't any quality content. And in particular, if I think in your field of VR learning, it was very much, I remember you could, probably the best learning experience that you could have is looking at, going on field trips and kind of visiting places all over the world, but there wasn't really, what I would consider quality content or interactive content. And I think that's, if I'm not mistaken, that's kind of your expertise and where you play, is this idea of immersive VR learning. Can you just give us an example of what, some of those immersive high quality VR learning experiences are like?
Yeah, absolutely. So while I've been at Talespin, I've had the opportunity to design for both hard skills and soft skills. So I'll give you an example of what hard skills might look like first, and then we'll switch to soft skills, which is something that we've been focused on a little bit more. So for the hard skills training, I had the opportunity to help design this HVAC training. It's a series of different labs that taught different HVAC services for technicians who would be going into the field. And I want to say it was probably one of the largest projects that I've ever worked on. And what was really great and cool about this lab was that it was actually a full recreation of a lab that students would go into for the program that they were in. And what this was meant to do was help students practice these HVAC services when they did not have access to the lab on campus. And so, they were at the time, during the pandemic, distributed. And so doing some remote learning and remote work. And so they would, in theory, while we were, so they would, in theory, use these headsets to practice before coming into the lab to really help build their skills, their competence, and ensure they have sort of the right systems in place to be able to build their skills, come into the lab, do it a little bit, be able to exert those newly acquired skills and capabilities observed by an instructor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it did provide this opportunity for remote learning and bridging that gap to when they were going on campus.
It's interesting. I was just talking to somebody recently who was an Air Force training pilot,
Hmm.
and something that he brings up is the idea of rigorous training is not just being able to kind of have folks sit in a room and then get behind a cockpit. There's a lot of touches with the learner, a lot of intermediate stages. And it sounds like this, where maybe the solution was a remote solution at the time, but then this is also, if you look at that progression, they have an opportunity to practice those skills in a much safer environment rather than handling the systems, the hardware in front of them.
Absolutely. And, when we think about things like high cost, machines cost a lot of money, right? Potentially high risk circumstances. And so that's really what virtual reality is great for, right? It's a true affordances of virtual realities that you can recreate and provide opportunities to practice in opportunities of high stakes, maybe under the threat of danger, unusual circumstance or rare circumstances, right? And so these are things that we would like to prepare for, but may have difficulty trying to practice in those specific conditions. And really, if you're designing a virtual reality training, those are the types of experiences that you would want to reproduce or recreate, at least for the time and investment cost, right? And that's not to say that that can't also be true for soft skills training, right? There's oftentimes that we encounter high stakes, high risk, right? Interpersonal risk experiences, interpersonal experiences with others socially. And those are times that we want to be able to prepare for and practice so that when we are faced with that situation in real life, we feel confident in our abilities to apply our skills to then be able to succeed in those sort of high stakes, high risk conversations.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point where it's, when you're talking about high stakes training, it's the reason it's high stakes is because the consequence of doing the wrong thing or making the wrong decision has it's magnified. So like I in those soft skills conversations, if you're learning manager training and you are trying to learn something like radical candor, that's a or an employee is going through a difficult situation. It's the consequences of saying the wrong thing in that moment could have extremely negative consequences. And I think a lot of the training that we see that happens in the workplace is low stakes. Like if you were to even if you were to send out an email and maybe you forgot to hide some personal identifying information from a spreadsheet, yes, that could be bad. But if it's only going out to one or two people, that's not the worst thing in the world. But everything that it seems like is fit for VR is, how can I get even just an attempt at a situation before I have to experience in real life? Is that kind of the breakdown that you have as far as what is fit? I guess the question here is, what is really fit for VR at this moment? Because I've seen things like public speaking, and that's a good scenario to be in. But it seems like this hard skills training where there's expensive machinery on the line or high stakes, that seems to be what qualifies for VR versus something that would be less of a fit.
Yes, that's definitely the case for hard skills. When we think about soft skills, we think about those really tough interpersonal situations that we get in, right? Maybe having to fire someone, maybe having to address sexual harassment with someone, building trust or restoring trust on a team that you're on, or having to navigate conflicts within a team meeting, right? There's these really uncomfortable situations that we often find ourselves in that are sometimes just thrust on us.
Yeah.
But wouldn't it be nice to be able to have built our skills in these different types of conversations, right? There's, perhaps there's topics around DEI, right? Or there's topics about how to gain buy-in from stakeholders. Maybe you're pitching an idea to investors. That's a very rare and high stakes circumstance that we you can't really replicate that until you are in it, right?
Yeah.
And so when thinking about what types of scenarios are best for VR, you really want to think about those instances in our lives in day to day that we may be facing that we may not even really feel comfortable participating in, right? And when we're thinking about virtual reality in general, it's very immersive. And because of that, you want to be able to thrust people into these authentic situations and authentic scenarios. And when it comes to learning, right, that means that that brings that situational awareness, right?
Yeah.
But
Mhm.
not only just like what they're seeing or what humans are talking to them or what machinery they're interacting with, but it's embodied. Learners are expected to engage with the world around them, either through manipulating objects or talking to virtual humans. They are acting on this space and then they're receiving the consequences of their actions. And so it's very embodied, very visceral. And what's great about virtual reality is, as compared to some like a role play in real life, is the repeatable conditions that
Yes.
we're able to put learners into.
When when you were talking about the idea of role play, I mean, I think this is something that even in like face to face, I know that a lot of more traditional L&D folks prefer face to face so that they can see the reaction or things like that. But I think where it sounds like VR goes a step further is, when it allows you to actually immerse yourself in the environment where those things are actually happening. Because in a
Mhm.
role play, when you're sitting across from somebody who's sitting in a chair, in two chairs in front of the rest of the class, it's like, I'm not going
Right.
to have this sexual harassment conversation in front of 20 of my peers. I'm going to be having it in somewhere maybe offsite, or maybe
Mhm.
somewhere a hidden corner of the office where I'm trying to preserve somebody's privacy. And so it's even just being in the environment that makes things change. Two things
Yeah.
that you mentioned are the idea of the scenario.
Mhm.
And then also, I think, and maybe didn't mention this yet, but when you say like repeat tries at something, there's
Mhm.
a component there of feedback as well, where you
Of
get
course,
to
yeah.
see what you did wrong, and you get to respond to that and fix that. And I think before we get into actually building these scenarios, because I think that's a whole world in itself. Can you talk a little bit about um, what's the role of feedback in these situations? Like, how do you I think feedback, from previous conversations, it's about a big part of that is what you're noticing or what you're focusing on, because there's so many things that you could tell someone as they repeat a scenario. Can you
Mhm.
kind of walk me through how is feedback designed into the experiences that you produce at Tailspin?
Yeah. So feedback is extremely important. And there's different ways in which learners can receive feedback, right? And let's talk about formative feedback first. So in these conversations, learners are engaging with virtual humans in first person. And oftentimes, in terms of formative feedback, if this is a sort of a scored scenario, uh, we will track learners and really rate their different response options that they select. So,
Can you break that
yes,
down for us, like
of course.
like a scored scenario? Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So let's say we're engaged in or I'm in a conversation with a virtual human, and perhaps this is a sales scenario, and I am attempting to sell internet to a customer who has come into our store.
Hmm.
And there, in terms of learning, there's certain things that behaviors that I would need to demonstrate to have a successful sales conversation, right? I would probably need to introduce myself. I will need to um, learn about the customer's needs, maybe their lifestyle, draw inferences from what I'm seeing and what the learner or the virtual human is saying, and then address their needs, and then recommend a solution that our company may offer, and then have maybe there's like a closing line that I would need to say. And so let's say that those are our key behaviors that we're looking for learners to demonstrate. And so when we're designing a conversational based narrative, we will almost map out where those elements come in the different points of the conversation, and provide those opportunities for learners to be able to articulate that to the virtual human. They may choose to do so in a specific way, or not, right? And based off of the decisions that they're making. So oftentimes we'll have, like in a scenario-based conversation, 3 different response options that learners can choose from. Depending on the choice that they make and the response that they vocalize, we will score what skills are demonstrated in that conversation, and also how well that conversation aligns to the behaviors that we're looking for learners to demonstrate in order, as aligned to the learning objectives. And so that occurs for every decision point. So we're really tracking learners every decision learners make within the space, and capturing what skills they're demonstrating, whether or not they're demonstrating the behaviors that need to be demonstrated in a certain point of time. And of course, we're always trying to allow learners to recover so that when they maybe make a misstep early on in the conversation, they still have an opportunity to succeed. Because that's what it's like in real life, right?
Yeah. I think the thing that comes to mind when I think of that is, if I were in the sales scenario and I reach a decision point and I select, let's say let's say there are 3 choices, A, B, and C, and I select A, and the correct response, or the response that you're looking to score correctly, is C. What kind of feedback am I given as a learner?
Yeah. So if you are in a scored scenario, you may have, we have these visual cue options that we can show learners. Maybe if you chose the really suboptimal response, it's a red. So learners know, like, oh, that was not quite right. But they will also likely know, based off of what the virtual human then articulates to them, and says, hey, that's not what I said, or that's not what I asked for. Right. And so, this, unlike something like a multiple choice questionnaire, right? This is it's interactive, and learners are, as they are experiencing this conversation, they are experiencing the consequences of their responses firsthand, as they would in real life, right? If you and I were talking and I start talking about something completely different, you're like, that is not the question I asked.
I think that it also reminds me that, if I see red and there's like a trigger question, it's also like, it feels like a bit of conditioning as well, where it's like, oh, that was the wrong choice. Now I'm aware, hopefully I'll do something that's feedback in the moment, where I'm kind of processing, when I see this, when I get this question, my response, I won't give that response in the future. I'm curious, what does a decision tree look like for something this complex? Like, there has, in my opinion, for if this is, people programming these conversations, there has to be a limit at what you as the person can measure or choose to measure or score in a particular scenario. So let's get into like the design of this. What is a branch? How's a branch like this created for a program?
Yeah, there are different ways to branch depending on what type of conversation it is, right? Sometimes we have a role play conversation, or like a lesson, what we call a lesson conversation, where we are teaching learners in this more like coaching fashion. So there's less of that branching and more of this it's a little bit linear, but with different options for how learners respond. And so that is very different from, let's say, a full branch scenario where we're testing learners on, a variety of different skills and maybe like 1 or 2 learning objectives. right? And where we really want learners to exhibit we really want to provide various opportunities for learners to demonstrate the skills that they need that we're looking for. And so with that, when thinking about, we want to be able to provide as many opportunities for learners, that sort of branching does get very large. Sometimes if it's too large, we call it like a spaghetti monster, and we kind of want to avoid something like that. But there are different times where, if the learner branches down a poor path, but they recover, they're able to loop back and somehow join the middle path, or same thing for the middle path. And so they do get quite large, but we are restricted by the amount of time that we want learners to engage in a conversation, right? We like our conversations to be about 15 minutes long for really large branching conversations, so that, if we have two different conversations within one module, we're hoping that our learning experience will be, between 20 and 30 minutes long. We don't really want learners to stay in the headset any longer than that, because it does get fairly tiresome, both, on the neck and head, but also the eyes. We're not quite there yet where the learners can comfortably experience these learning experiences for like hours on end, unfortunately. But also in terms of learning, we don't want that. We want spaced and repeated practice.
Yes.
But to kind of go back to your question about feedback, what after all those long branching nodes, oftentimes we will provide very formative and tailored feedback at the very end of the conversation. Telling learners what we saw them demonstrate, telling learners what their strengths and growth areas are, right? And generally how well they performed and how they could do better. So that is something that we try to incorporate.
It sounds like there's a VR component to all this, but there's also the human component to all this, and the feedback is still delivered. Kind of, it's like this. The scenario is always going to be the assessment, but then you as the human are going to communicate that feedback. Is it like a debrief, or is it like or do you also do like a full-on coaching where it's like, hey, at this point you made this decision, let's try this next time? Or do you just kind of repeat back the data to the learner and then they interpret? How does it work?
We've done that several different ways, and it really depends on the use case. So sometimes we'll have feedback pop-ups that provide very tailored information. Sometimes we'll have debrief sessions with a virtual human to talk about what went well, what went wrong, and how you could improve. And sometimes
when you say virtual, sorry to interrupt, when you say virtual humans, do you mean like this happens within the space of the experience itself?
Oh, typically it'll be a completely separate conversation with like a coach. That was not part of the original, like the assessment conversation.
But is that a virtual human, or is that a human reporting in virtually? Okay, great.
A virtual human. That's a great question. A virtual human, so like a non-player character within this space that is not operated by anyone else, in the physical world.
Now we're getting to something interesting. I think this is where our worlds kind of collide, where we're talking about a virtual human and a synthetic human. I think I'm very curious. How do you design that coach, or how do you design? Because I think ultimately with these emerging technologies, what it allows us to do is scale a human capability to a certain extent. What a human can do, like that would be a person at work who you would you would take an assessment, take those results to that in-house coach, and they would give you feedback and debrief you. But in your case, it's a virtual human. So I don't know if this is a huge part of the design, or if it's not. But I'm interested to hear, like, what is that experience like in terms of designing the coach, or how do you deliver that feedback, and how do you design that person for that experience? And I know that's a lot of questions, so I can pitch them to you one by one.
No, yeah. So when we think about, well, in terms of the virtual human, their embodiment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we have an amazing art team who has been able to bring a number of different characters to life, and those characters are automatically programmed within our no-code authoring tool, Copilot Designer. And so we can select, we have what we call it a virtual human library. So we can select any of those virtual humans that fit the character, the physical appearance of someone that we want to use. If we want to create a net new character, then we would need to collaborate with our art team to develop a new character, which we have. We do that often, and to get that integrated into our tool. When we think about the characters as like persona, the character that they're playing within the situation that we're putting learners into, we create character personas. So just as we might create learner personas to design for the specific learning experiences, we create character personas for the characters that learners will be interacting with, right? And these are really key people that learners interact with in a day-to-day basis in terms of, you know, the situation that we're asking learners to engage in, right? So for instance, in that sales conversation that we were discussing earlier, the learner might play the role of a sales assistant or sales agent, and the various characters that they are engaging in, if it's a sales conversation, is potentially different customers, right? We might have like a customer with a persona that is like generally angry, or maybe is tight, has a tight budget, or has all these different, you know, confounding circumstances that make the scenario very hard for the learner, right? And that's really what we want to do in terms of creating characters, right? We not only want them to be authentic, but with that authenticity comes real problems that those characters are dealing with, right?
Yeah.
So it's right. So one of my favorite character personas is this guy named Pete. And Pete is, I think he's an IB banker. He has lots of student loans, and he is expected to be on call 24/7, but the internet is perhaps getting a little tight on his budget.
Yeah.
And so he's conflicted with, you know, wanting to save money, but then also needing to be online 24/7. And that's a real dilemma for the learner who is trying to sell something like the internet, right?
Yes.
An internet package, where the learner's incentive is to, you know, sell the right internet package for the customer, so the customer doesn't come back and want to return it or cancel it. But also the learner is expected to upsell, and that's difficult for someone who might be telling you that they have issues, you know, with their budget.
Yeah. And it's you as the learner trying to interpret all those characteristics of the different persona, make decisions around what to say based off of what that other character is putting out. Really, it's the richness of the character that I think defines whether or not, how useful this experience would be. I'm curious, how much can you tune? Like, let's say we had Darren, who, you know, is a banker who's time poor and but also a family man. It's like, how much I'm sure it's easy to, I'm not easy, but I'm sure you could design that persona, but can you dial it up? Like, how much precision do you have? Can you dial up how frantic Darren is, or can you dial down how much of a family man this person is, rather than these just characteristics?
Yeah. So in terms of his demeanor, we are able to dial up his body language, you know, different with gestures or poses. We're able to dial up his like facial expressions. And we also have synthetic voices. And so those could be, you know, programmed in such a way that they convey something with high intensity. In terms of how family man he is, that will be humanly programmed by the the narrative that we're writing. So the dialogue that we're providing, or the virtual human that they would say to the learner who is playing the sales customer service agent. And so you would see, let's say something like a family man, perhaps that he says he has to go to his son's baseball game soon. He has a short amount of time, or my daughter really likes to play video games, and so we need a large bandwidth, something like that. So you can pick up on like these subtleties that the virtual human will disclose in the conversation, and learners would need to pick up on that to be able to recommend a viable package, like internet package for the customer.
It's interesting because like the character design, it's not like you're just turning up gestures to make them more pronounced in some cases or less. It's the details of the story, and kind of not just who the person appears on the outside, but getting to their own mindset and their own decision making. When you're thinking about designing personas or designing these scenarios, I have a hunch that your life has changed recently with generative AI tools. And I say that because with large language models, they're able to more easily come up with examples and characters. Is that the case? Are you folding generative AI or ChatGPT into this process now? Has it changed anything for you?
We have been folding it in, and I think what it has changed is how quickly we can get these artifacts to SMEs. Right. So, oftentimes we have the opportunity to interview subject matter experts or target users, and then synthesize that information. I ideate on personas, and then check it back with them to see, how valid is it? Does this seem like a realistic person for our learners or the circumstances and the people that they're interacting with? And what generative AI has done was expedite the process of creating learner personas, or synthesizing the information we have, right, to then create a persona or multiple renditions of personas that we can then validate with subject matter experts, right? So it's not necessarily that we're taking the personas that ChatGPT is or any other Gen AI tool is just kind of spitting out, but I think it has expedited the process of getting things into the hands of our subject matter experts for critique, and so we can more easily iterate on the artifacts that we need to.
Yeah, I think that's in general kind of the state of the tech at the moment. We call it the human AI sandwich, where it's like the human has the inputs and the intent, the AI does its thing, and then the human measures the output for many different reasons. But I'm curious, I think personas and character building, and in particular for scenario based learning, there is a need to develop that full story. And I'm curious, have you everyone has a ChatGPT guide, but do you have a process or prompts or steps that you go through that other folks can copy to help develop those personas a little bit more easily?
We do internally. We have a prompt library that all of our internal Talespin team and all of our clients have access to. And that has we just had last week had a webinar sort of explaining how we at Talespin have adopted generative AI and integrated it into our processes. And so one of the things we talked about in that webinar was the standard operating procedure for designing virtual reality and learning experiences, and how we have aligned our prompt library to every step of our SOP. Yeah.
Can you share kind of at a high level what kind of the stages are without sharing out the prompts, or can you kind of walk us through what that process, the SOP looks like?
Yeah, I will say that our process is not unlike any other instructional design process, right? So there's this discovery phase, there's a design phase, a development phase, and a deployment phase, right? And so specifically for the discovery and design, I think that's where a lot of our instructional design comes in before it's iterative design. And so for that, we've really broken down, subject matter expert interview, learning objectives, skills, module outline, things and we really just operationalized our tasks as we go through creating a virtual reality experiences, and then ideated and prompt engineered different prompts that help produce the outputs that we want to see at each operationalized phase. And I would honestly recommend that same procedure for anyone who wants to really optimize and standardize their way of design. It has honestly brought a lot of clarity to our team that has helped us really help define and standardize the way we do things at Talespin.
Mm-hmm. So it's mapping each of those prompts that you would use for each of the stages, and I think something that I'm pulling out from there is that it's not that there's not the idea of I think the idea of a mega prompt is almost unless you're creating a conversational model, something that you can actually dialogue with to help you think through things and have it hold a set of beliefs. That way of working is not as effective as being able to generate the right prompts for different stages of the design, have a conversation, make sure that you crystallize what you're thinking during discovery, based off of insights, or maybe it's coming up with the questions you should ask for the design stage. It's making sure you have all the key questions that you need for a prototype. For development, it's, am I missing, what stages should I be thinking about, and kind of iterating on each of those stages with prompts until you get to a final idea. Because I think, as you said, it's not going to do the work for you, but it's helping to standardize that process with which you navigate through designs of scenarios at Talespin.
Yeah. And, as you mentioned, this using like things like ChatGPT and prompting, that is very iterative, right? It's a sort of this organic flowing conversation, and to really try and get what you want. And oftentimes, even when we get somewhat close to what we want, we then move that outside of that tool and iterate it on it out, elsewhere. So I do agree that, those mega prompts they're helpful to some extent, but I don't think they can take you from A to Z. One of the things that I've been experimenting with recently has been prompt chaining. And so that's when you sort of chain prompts together based on outputs using Google Sheets. And I would just quick shout out, the AI Exchange has a fantastic prompt chaining template for anyone who wants to go follow their newsletter. I'm not associated with them at all, but they've just really helped me with really upskill in prompt engineering.
Can you give us an example of what a prompt chain might look like, or sound like at a high level?
Yeah, so a prompt chain might be you input all of your findings from like subject matter experts or synthesis, and what you can do is ask it maybe to synthesize it in how many words or so. Afterward, you may be able to ask it to come up with a number of different, let's say, what you were looking for. Sorry, let me just redo that.
Sure.
So an example would be, let's say you're doing some research around a specific topic that you're not very familiar with, right? But you have to create a module on it. And so perhaps you're using different tools like Elicit or SciSpace or Perplexity, asking about that specific subject. And you can collect all of that information, and then you could input it. Let's say that's your first input. And you can have a prompt that follows that, maybe synthesizes it, right? And then you could perhaps have a prompt that follows that says, based on these findings, create a mock interview between, or like create SME questions. And then maybe the next one is like a mock interview, right? And then maybe you're doing a mock interview, asking it to perform like a cognitive task analysis or something. And then afterward, you chain that output into create learning objectives for a course that would
so it's essentially you're starting off with your base input data, which is coming directly from your SMEs. So you have these kind of open response questions. You're asking for the insights, and then you're saying, based off of those insights, let's go into the next stage. Let's come up with prototypes, or what are the questions that are the big questions that are coming out of these key insights that I should, what are the knowledge and skills that are being identified? And then you're able to just kind of, like you said, chain all of this information, and it's building off of this data set, but also the questions and the decisions that the large language model is making. And eventually that leads to your output, which will be more focused. So again, it's not about the mega prompt, but it's about giving large language models enough information to then kind of shave down and focus the response into something that's a bit more useful towards the end, but you still have to do the work.
Absolutely. Spot on.
You can't get away with it yet. AI can't do the work for you. But I think that's a good place to end our conversation, because I think everybody's still messing with ChatGPT, even if the hype has died down a little bit. But I think prompt chaining is the most useful skill I've seen. So, Kristin, if folks want to get in touch with you, learn more about Talespin, where can they go?
Yeah, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. My Twitter name is Kris, Kris Torrence, LXD.
All right. And we'll be sure to put a link to that in the show notes. But Kristin, it was wonderful to have you on. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's been great.